Okay, let's kick this off. So Swift just gave you a great overview of budgeting. You've heard about kind of the high-level framework of organizing a hackathon. I'm here to tell you about sponsorship. So why did they make me give this talk? Swift actually gave a fantastic version of this talk a little while ago, and his beautiful deck design skills came into play here, so you may notice some similarities. But I'm John Gottfried. I'm one of the co-founders of MLH, and I'm tasked with dealing with our corporate partners and sponsors. So all day, every day, my full-time job is sponsorship. I used to be a developer evangelist at a company called Twilio, and then previously at a company called EchoNest. And I also ran an organization called Startup Bus. So I have not only sponsored a ton of events, but I have also raised sponsorship for a lot of events. I've done everything from $500 sponsorships to multi-million-dollar sponsorships. It's a pretty wide range here, and I'm here to tell you the basics. So we're going to talk specifically about hackathon sponsorship. Sponsorship itself is a huge industry beyond hackathons. You see Coca-Cola sponsoring like the Super Bowl. That's a sponsorship as well. In this case, we're going to talk about just hackathons. So here's what we're going to cover today. The first thing, how do sponsors think? So Dave, Danielle, Mike, Justin, I'm apologizing preemptively because I'm giving away all of your secret sauce, but we're going to talk about how sponsors think and how they evaluate opportunities. We're going to lay the groundwork for how you actually get sponsors on board and get them to give you money. We're going to talk about sponsorship process and workflow, and then we're going to talk about some pro tips, pitfalls, and do Q&A. So let's kick this off with the basics. Understanding sponsors. Why do companies sponsor hackathons? Well, there's typically three big reasons. The first reason is to get product feedback, right? A company wants access to developers who are a new audience to tell them what they think about their product, and they can take that back to help iterate and improve what they're building. The second is marketing. There's a couple of different types of marketing I'll detail in a little bit. And the third is recruitment. So first, product feedback. I'm sponsoring a hackathon because I want to watch people use and interact with my product in real time, gather that feedback, and bring it back to iterate on our product. This is really important for a lot of early stage companies, companies who have new products that they're launching in the market. Hackathons are a great captive audience for them because they get a lot of really smart people playing with their product for a long period of time. And these people are very vocal about it, right? Developers always have an opinion about everything. So what kind of perks could you sell a sponsor in this category, right? Distribution is a huge one. The ability to distribute their product to a wide audience and help them gather that feedback is probably the number one thing they're looking for. Second thing is branding exposure, right? If you're launching a new product, you need to help people become aware of that brand and help build sort of a community around it so that next time people have already heard of it and they're familiar with what you're doing. And the third is basic interactions, right? So the ability to come to your hackathon and talk to your attendees and figure out what they're thinking, right? You're selling access to your attendees. Next, we're going to talk about marketing. So marketing has a lot of different areas that it covers. The key types for hackathons are typically developer marketing, brand marketing, and employment branding, which is another type of marketing. The goal here is to raise brand awareness, right? So to get more people aware of your brand and its values, and or to change brand perception, right? So I'm sure you've all seen a company that you didn't traditionally associate with hackathons sponsoring a hackathon. The reason for that is very likely that they want people to think about their brand in a different way than is traditional, right? So maybe they want people to think they're technologically innovative. Maybe they want people to think that they're a software company and not a bank, right? There's a lot of different nuances here, but branding is a huge part of sponsoring hackathons, especially at a high level, right? So the big dollars are typically marketing dollars. So what can you sell to these companies? The first is experiences, right? They want to create something that's really memorable that hackathon attendees will associate with their brand, right? So let's say you get a car company to bring a brand new car out to your event that people can hack on. People are going to remember that forever because how often do you have a hackable car at an event? So that's a huge opportunity for them to change their brand perception and also get people interacting with their product and associating with it in a different way. Second is branding position, right? So this is actual logo placement. How big is their logo? What is it on? Where is it? How many times do you smack developers in the face with it? You know, this sounds really dirty, but ultimately what these sponsors are looking for is to be associated with a really successful community-focused event, right? They're sponsoring you rather than doing this themselves because they know that you are creating something that people actually want to be a part of, and they want their brand associated with that. So they want their logo right up next to yours. Next is memorability. I talked about this a little bit with experiences, but they want their brand and their integration into your hackathon to be really memorable. It's way better for them to have that car in the parking lot for people to hack on than it is for them to just slap a logo on a t-shirt, right? Because every t-shirt has 20 logos. Next, recruitment. This is probably the primary funding source for all hackathon sponsorships on the college level. The goal here, right, is fairly obvious. Developers are very difficult to hire. Hackathons attract a lot of very talented developers. We want to hire them. Now, there's a couple of things you would sell here. The first is resumes. A lot of companies are sponsoring hackathons to get a huge dump of resumes. There's a little pushback against this because there's so many resumes now that they can't filter through them all. So you may want to get creative with how you're actually delivering those resumes to a sponsor. The next thing is thought leadership, right? So establishing that the people who work at your company are experts that not only students want to work alongside, but they want to learn from, right? So you probably choose who you're going to work for partly because you want to be able to glean some knowledge off of their expertise. And the last thing is interactions. So they want to be able to have recruiters at your event, have engineers at your event who can talk to your attendees, and you're selling them that access. So how do companies decide which events to sponsor? Now, it's important to note, as I'm sure a couple of the previous presenters have mentioned, there's going to be 150 student hackathons this year. That's a ton of events that are competing for these sponsor dollars. So how do they make their decision which to sponsor? So there's a couple of common evaluation methods. Swift touched on cost per attendee earlier. It's a little different from a sponsor's perspective. The attendee value, the sponsor landscape, the actual value of the sponsorship package, and then the force, like their gut feeling. So first, cost per attendee. This is bang for your buck, right? How much are they spending per attendee that they will be reaching at this hackathon? You want to, again, minimize this ratio. A sponsor is looking at the same value you are when you're budgeting for your hackathon, and they want to spend the least per person. So let's look at a couple of example events and why a sponsor might sponsor this versus a different event. So Dreamforce. Dreamforce is a huge conference, right? 135,000 attendees. They take over all of like SOMA in San Francisco. You could sponsor this hackathon, not a hackathon, it's a conference. You could sponsor this conference for $1.5 million, right? You're spending $11 per attendee. Now, that's a ton of money to drop, but it's also a huge audience to hit with a sponsorship. And there's all these tiers that go up and down, and each tier has a different cost per attendee. Now, someone might sponsor Dreamforce because they want to reach a really broad audience, but there's tons of other examples of conferences that charge more per attendee on a smaller scale. So PyCon is a great example. PyCon has about 2,000 attendees, but all of them are really, really interested in Python, right? So Dreamforce could be 135,000 completely different people, but PyCon attracts a very niche audience, so people are willing to pay more per attendee. But not only that, the ticket price is just objectively lower, right? So Dreamforce, you could spend 1.5 million. PyCon, maybe the max you spend is 50K, but you're reaching a more valuable audience for your brand, perhaps. So how do hackathons compare, right? So hackathons typically top out at around 1,000 to 2,000 attendees. You're all, for the most part, first-time hackathon organizers, so your events are probably going to top out at around 300 attendees. I honestly would not recommend organizing a 1,000-person event your first time. It's a little daunting. But the really interesting thing about hackathons is that companies are paying a premium to sponsor them. And this is because the audience that attends hackathons are not accessible in a dense group anywhere else, right? You can't really reach 1,000 of the smartest student developers in one place, except at like a huge hackathon. And the way to leverage this for your school, I'll dive into a little later. But ultimately, the calculation comes down to this. So how much are you spending per attendee, and how does that compare to your user acquisition cost, right? So if your cost on average to hire a developer is $10,000, then spending $500 per attendee is not unreasonable, okay? So this is the calculation that's going on here, right? It's a measure of how much you're spending per attendee and how much those attendees could be worth for your business, whether as a customer or an employee. If this doesn't work, then you're probably doing your sponsorship wrong. So the next thing is attendee value, right? Are these attendees particularly valuable to a brand? We've already looked at like the cost per attendee, but the cost per attendee is balanced against this attendee value. So I mentioned student hackers at hackathons are a niche audience that can't really be accessed elsewhere. That makes those attendees more valuable than other similar attendees at a broader event, right? That's the difference between Dreamforce and PyCon. The harder your attendees are to reach, the more valuable your sponsorship is. Next, sponsor landscape. This is a fun one. How many hackathons are there? How many sponsors are at the hackathon? How much is that event going to be a positive impact on your brand, right? How much is it worth? So, would you rather sponsor an event that has 100 sponsors and 100 logos up there, or do you rather be one of 3, right? That's fairly obvious. You have more of a chance to impact each person at the event if you are one of fewer sponsors, right? There's a reason that Hackcon only has really 5 sponsors, right? And then the co-working space that has hosted us here. It's because we know that the sponsors and the attendees will both get more value if it's not NASCAR. So, how much is a package worth, right? Am I sponsoring a package that is actually going to deliver results that I can bring back to my boss and look really good, okay? Am I getting my money's worth here? And last, the force. Does this feel like an event I should be sponsoring? Is it going to look good for my brand? Is it the right type of event? Do I trust these people? When I was at Twilio and we would sponsor events, one of the key criteria we looked at, even just as a basic filter, was do we think that this organizer is going to put on a good event for developers, right? If I looked at your event and I thought that you were like being exploitative, or maybe you were in it for the wrong reasons, or you were trying to just like make a huge profit off of all these people that were coming to your hackathon and you're going to steal the IP, like whatever it is, if it doesn't feel right, I'm not going to give you that money. There's a lot of trust involved here because someone is paying upfront for something that hasn't happened yet, right? So how do companies pay for event sponsorships? You've convinced them to sponsor, but where's that money coming from? So usually different people at a company handle the sponsorship itself and the budget for the sponsorship. That's a little confusing, right? But a company makes its budget typically on a quarterly basis, and those budgets are owned by a manager, and they allocate money to different initiatives on their team. So the person that you're reaching out to, that university recruiter who says, yeah, I'm going to give you $5,000 for your event, has to go to their boss and get that approved in the budget because there's a limited amount of money, and they have to be sure to allocate it intelligently. So we've found that the best times to get money, especially for recruiting, are Q1 and Q4. There's a couple of reasons for this, and it could vary from company to company. But in Q1, you have a lot of money that's just been allocated that you're really excited to spend. And in Q4, you've hit the end of the year, and you have leftover money that if you don't spend it, will get your budget slashed in the future, right? At big companies, if you don't spend your entire budget, then you haven't justified having that large of a budget, and so you lose it going forward. So it's actually really important, and this is so counterintuitive, for a company to spend all of their allocated budget because they want to keep that budget in the future. Recruiting budgets, though, in particular, are really, really seasonal. Most recruiting happens in the fall, September, October, November. There is some intern recruiting that goes on into the spring, and obviously there's enough money to fund the hackathons then, but the big kind of push is in the fall because that's really full-time recruiting season. That's when seniors are making their decisions. So what kind of sponsors are out there, right? We've talked about where that money is coming from, kind of what the calculation looks like for a sponsor, what types of companies would get involved, and how might they get involved. So there's 5 key types of sponsors that we broke down here. One is financial, next is presenting, third is an anchor brand, fourth is a strategic partner, and fifth is in-kind. And I'll tell you exactly what all of these mean. First, financial. Companies that trade cash for value. Great, someone's giving you money in exchange for a service or a product. That is the most typical type of hackathon sponsorship. It's simple, it's easy, it makes sense. But ultimately, it's not that creative, right? Because someone is buying a package at your event. It can get way weirder than that and way more valuable. Next type of sponsor is a presenting sponsor. These are those brands that want to be so deeply associated with your event that they will pay a premium to be next to your logo, right? MLH's presenting sponsor is Dell and Intel because they realize that in order to reach developers, they need to be part of a community that actually cares about developers, right? And so it's more important for them to be next to our logo and learn from our expertise than it is to try and roll out their own program. And this happens at a lot of hackathons, especially bigger ones. Next is anchor brands. These are companies that other sponsors look at when evaluating a sponsorship opportunity, right? You may have noticed that like the same companies sponsor a lot of hackathons, and then there's a lot of other random companies that you've never heard of. That's because of these anchor brands. Twilio is a great example, right? Like every hackathon seems to have Twilio as a sponsor somehow. You want to know why? Like what the secret is? The secret is that because Twilio delivers so much value outside of money, people want them at their hackathon, and other sponsors have started to look at them as a sign of quality for that event because they trust Twilio's vetting process, right? Same is true of Andreessen Horowitz. And a lot of the other sponsors you'll see, it's that people trust their vetting process so much and know that they go to high quality events and deliver quality to events in a way that they want to emulate, right? Next is strategic partners. These are companies that may not have big budgets, but they have a lot of other resources that you can tap into. You'll notice some hackathons have a media sponsor, right? This could be a TechCrunch that instead of giving you money, agrees to write a ton of articles about your event. That's great press. You could have a General Assembly or a Flatiron School where they actually come out and bring teachers to run workshops at your event. You could have a YC, right? You could have another incubator. You could have a VC who's really coming out and helping give people opportunities beyond the scope of the weekend. These companies help you a lot with a lot of different factors, but it may not be money. And the last is in-kind sponsors. So these are companies that give you goods or services instead of money. And you value those goods or services for your attendees. Red Bull, right? Almost all of your campuses have a Red Bull rep. They'll basically never give you money, but they'll give you free Red Bull, and then you don't have to buy it. That's great. It's a win-win. Same with like challenge posts. They're a service that is provided for free to hackathons to improve them, but they are not a sponsor in the same way that a recruiter is a sponsor. Okay, great. So those are the 5 types of sponsors. How do you actually go about getting them? What is the nuts and bolts of getting money for your event? So we're going to lay the groundwork here. Sponsors are a lot like investors. They both have egg-shaped heads. That was a joke. You should approach a sponsor when you're doing well. What does that mean? If you were to walk into a VC's office and pitch them a startup, right? The typical response you're going to get is, wow, that's awesome. That's such a good idea. Cool. Like, how many users do you have, right? How many paying customers do you have? Do you have any IP that you've developed that's really innovative? They're looking for these signals that demonstrate that you have traction. Same exact thing for hackathons. No one wants to sponsor your hackathon if you don't have like people going to it. No one wants to sponsor your hackathon if you don't have a space to put it in. So what are the key things that you need to get people to sponsor your hackathon? Well, you need a vision, right? Because people want to feel like they're part of something bigger that's not just about the money. You need a website, because if you don't have a website, you basically don't exist on the internet. You need pre-registrations. So even if you haven't opened up registration yet, just having people express interest in your event is a good sign of traction. Hopefully, you'll have a venue, but they might not be locked down yet. But you should have progress to show, right? You should have a couple of dates that you're choosing between so that people know you're serious. And you should have other sponsors. This is a chicken or egg problem because you have to get that first sponsor somehow, but having other sponsors is really helpful because there's a lot of groupthink with sponsorship, right? I want to sponsor events that companies that I respect sponsor, okay? So first you want to prepare an itemized budget for the event. Swift just talked about this, but it's really important to match up your sponsorship targets with the budget for what you want to spend on your event, because otherwise you're going to have a huge problem. You also need to know where the money actually goes. Swift touched on this very briefly, but basically, when sponsors give you money, where is that money being held and who is responsible for spending it? Schools will typically handle this for you, but they take a cut, right? They might take 10% of your sponsorship money just for doing the accounting. There are other companies that might do this for you as well. You could do this yourself with an LLC or a nonprofit. I will tell you that accounting is a huge pain in the ass, and that if at all possible, get someone else to do it. And get someone who you actually respect to do it, because if they fuck it up, it could have serious implications for you, okay? So do this right, or don't do it at all. Next, you need to design a really good sponsorship prospectus. And this is something we're going to go into a lot more detail about. So there are a couple types of sponsorship prospectuses that we see. The first is a tiers document, the second is PowerPoint, and the third is a custom proposal. So, tiers document. These are usually 1 to 2 pages long. They provide a pretty basic overview of sponsorship tiers, right? They might talk about how packages compare to one another, what the vision of your event is, why it's so cool compared to this other hackathon. It's pretty basic. Every event should have sponsorship tiers that they can lay out in some form for the sponsors that are considering them. Next is a PowerPoint deck. These generally give a higher level overview about your event or your company. What is your company? What's your team's history? How did you get so many people to come out to your event? Is it in like a special venue? Do you have cool like tech there? Is your school really involved? Like, what's the story you want to tell? Most sponsorship decks are usually some combination of these two, or if you're really crazy, you could do both. A deck is really good for a cold email because it gives people an overview that might hook them into being interested in sponsorship. And then the tiers lay out the actual like dollars and cents, right? So it's up to you what order you want to go in. I'll talk about this a little later. Next is custom proposals. So this is mostly what I do. And you'll probably need to do this if you have any like really weird sponsors or you have a presenting sponsor. It's come up with something customized that serves their needs. This is a art more than a science, and it really comes from talking to them, doing some customer development, figuring out what they actually care about and how you're going to help them meet those goals, and then you prepare a proposal that outlines those. For example, you wouldn't send a sponsorship prospectus about recruitment to a car company that just wants people to like sit in their car, right? They have completely different goals, and so sometimes you need to customize it. So what should you always include in a sponsorship prospectus? There's some really basic things that people frequently forget. The name of your event, when it's happening, where it's happening, how many people are coming, how do you see more info on the website, and who do you contact about sponsorship opportunities? I can't tell you how many sponsorship prospectuses I see that have all these great packages and not a single email address on the document, right? If they can't contact you, they're not going to give you money. So let's talk about sponsorship tiers and how they look. What should you ask? How many tiers should I have? How much should they cost? And what perks should apply to each one, right? So first, how many tiers should you have? Probably 3. Most sponsorship prospectuses have a really reasonable tier that seems kind of cheap. They have one that's kind of in the middle, and they have one that's really expensive if you just like spending money. The reason you have 3 tiers has to do with this concept of anchor pricing. When you set out pricing for comparable packages, people are weighing them against one another, and whatever you say is valuable in that context is what they will value, right? So if you say that the lowest tier is 5,000 and the highest tier is 50,000, that's a huge gap. If you say that the lowest tier is 20,000 and the highest tier is 50,000, that's not as big of a gap, and so it's less of a jump to kind of justify the price increase, right? You want to get the best bang for your buck for that event. And if you've already decided that event is valuable, you're going to be deciding which package to go through. And that will be really, really important when you define that pricing, because you don't want it too far apart and you don't want it too close together, because both of those make it too hard to decide. So you can use your cost per attendee calculation to calculate how much money you need. It really, really varies from event to event, and it really varies depending on your budget. Unfortunately, there's no formula for this. It's kind of just something you have to figure out. You'll notice that if you look at a lot of hackathon sponsorship prospectuses, new events and small events cost less than sponsoring an established event. However, when you get up to the level where people know who you are and they want to sponsor your event regardless, that allows you to charge a premium, right? So your brand becomes important in justifying this price. And what perks to go in each tier? I mentioned this earlier, but sponsors value what you say is valuable. Why does everyone think it's really important to get up and talk to your attendees, even though most sponsor talks at a hackathon are completely valueless for them? It's because people put that in the prospectus and charge a premium for it, and so people think it's valuable, right? If you're getting up there and boring people for an hour with a great keynote talk that you just paid $50,000 for, that's great for the hackathon because they just got $50,000. Terrible for you because you just wasted everyone's time and they think less of you, right? So this is something that you have to think about. How do you make your sponsors be most successful with the perks you're offering? And how do you make the experience the best for the attendees? Because you're selling access to the attendees and you're selling their time, and that is worth way more than money is. Because if you betray that trust, they're never going to come back to your event, right? So this is a balancing act where you figure out how to provide value for sponsors and how to provide value for attendees. Great. So we figured that out. Now, let's create a process for actually getting sponsors. So stop me if your sponsorship process sounds a little like this. You send someone an email, some magic happens, and then you get a bunch of money, right? Are you kidding me? That's terrible. Oh my God. That is a recipe for disaster. What is our sponsorship process? And the sponsorship process you should probably follow. First, set targets and do research. Second, get in touch. Third, have a phone call. Fourth, have a proposal or prospectus. And then follow up relentlessly. So setting targets. Figure out what companies you want to sponsor and who actually makes those purchasing decisions, right? Go look at other hackathons in your area and see who sponsors them. Go look at a list of companies that just raised a huge Series A and are probably going to be hiring a bunch of interns, right? Look at people who have alums from your school in high-level positions. Look at companies where they might only recruit from your school and it's one of their big targets. All of those people are really likely to spend money on your event because you've filtered them in some way. LinkedIn is pretty good for this. Sometimes you have to pay for it. There are some hacks around that. Data.com I find is a little less good because it's so much data and it's pretty diluted. And the last is CEO email. This is a pretty gutsy move, but it's one I highly recommend from personal experience. Find out the CEO of a company, and this could be a huge company or it could be a tiny company, and email them personally and appeal to them, right? Say, hey, really respect what you're doing. You're awesome. You're building something cool. We would love to have you out at our event. Like, you know, how can we get you out? We're so excited about this, right? Because CEOs at big companies, they have people to filter their emails for them and filter them to the right person, and so you'll get directed to the right person. And at small companies, the CEO might be making these decisions themselves, okay? So in both situations, it's a win-win. Get an introduction from someone in your network. So getting in touch, you can do the cold email. It's far less effective than a warm email because if someone's introducing you to someone, they typically have a rapport with them and they trust each other, right? So if I introduce you to a company where I'm like, hey, these people are putting on a fantastic event, you should consider sponsoring it, that has a lot more weight than if they've never heard of you and you just email them cold saying, hey, we're putting on a fantastic event. LinkedIn is good for this. Facebook is surprisingly good for this. Like, look up your friends that work at different companies or like, they could be people you've never talked to in like 10 years, right? But if they work at a cool company that you want to sponsor your event, they'll probably put you in touch with the right person. I've actually had a ton of success doing this on Twitter too, where I'll just tweet at some random person who like has university recruiting at like whatever company in their bio and like, hey, can I email you? You sound really cool. And they'll give me their email. It's great. Or you could Google people. I find that's a little harder. It'll probably take more time, but Facebook and Twitter are really good. Next, you want to set up a phone call immediately, right? So you've emailed them, you've gotten in touch, you've piqued their interest. Now you want to get them on the phone. There's a couple of reasons for this. Some are psychological, right? One is that they're giving you time. Once they've put time on the table, which is probably their most valuable asset, they've already considered sponsoring your event to the point where they want to hear more, okay? Get their time, but don't waste their time, right? Try to be concise, get to the point quickly, value what they're giving you here, and make the best use of it. When you get them on the phone, I like to ask people first up, like, A, have they sponsored hackathons before? That's really important because if they haven't, you have to educate them about why they're valuable. And B, if they have sponsored a hackathon, what has happened, right? Like, how did it perform? What did they like? What did they not like? What were their metrics that they took back to their boss? And you can use all of that data. If that's the first thing you ask on the phone call, you can use that all and pitch them your event in the context that they already believe, right? So you ask, oh, you know, what do you like about hackathons? What are your favorite sponsorship opportunities? And they're like, oh, we love resumes and a booth and being able to give out swag at registration. And then you're like, oh, wow, we have this fantastic package that meets all of your needs. That's great, okay? When you're pitching them, frame it in the context they understand. Sell them your team and your vision, right? We have a lot of really smart people. We're doing this event at our school. We're really trying to like create this hacker community here. We've never had this much interest before. It's exploding. It's huge. It's epic, whatever. And then let them talk, right? They should be doing most of the talking on this call, and you should just get to the point where you're pitching them what you're selling in the context of what they care about, and then send them more details over email. Next, proposal. You had the phone call. They're already kind of interested. They want to hear more. They want to figure out what package they want to buy. You need to send an email that A, recognizes what they told you, right? No one wants to be sent a form letter. B, is going to frame this again in a context that they understand, because what's most likely going to happen is that they'll forward that email to their boss and all of their colleagues, right? So it needs to give enough info that it gives background, but not so much that it's tedious. And then it gives you the details, right? Give them that prospectus, give them that tier sheet so they can look down and figure out what they're going to buy. Very important things to do. Set a damn deadline, right? Tell them, hey, our t-shirts are going to print on July 15th, and if you don't agree to sponsor by then, you're done, okay? Deadlines are scary because it's like, oh, what if they say no? Well, would you rather have someone saying no or just ignoring you? Next, set up a follow-up call. If they've already decided to sponsor, that call could be about the details of the sponsorship, how it's going to work, getting them excited about the event. If not, it could be another last-ditch effort to get them on board. And be concise, right? You want to give them enough info to send along, but not so much that they're just like, oh, a wall of text, you know, trash. Follow up relentlessly. This is one of the hardest things for people to do if they haven't done sales before, because sometimes it requires you to send 5 emails to the same person when they haven't responded. Sometimes you have to find their phone call on Facebook and call them, right? It sounds really creepy. It's effective. No one's doing that. And if they have a million other things on their plate, which they definitely do, then you need to get their attention somehow by any means necessary. So follow up relentlessly. You need an answer, right? It doesn't matter what that answer is, but you need to get an answer from that person. I use RelateIQ extensively. It's a fantastic CRM and contact management solution. Basically what it does, just to like simplify it, takes every company I'm talking to, the people at the company I'm talking to, and what my last communication with them has been, and everyone else at MLH can see that, right? So someone can look in and see, oh, John emailed them a week ago and they said that they weren't interested. Or I could see, hey, I emailed them a month ago and they never responded. I should definitely follow up. It's a little expensive, but if you have the budget, it's probably worth investing in. Boomerang and followup.cc are really fantastic because they allow you to bounce emails back into your inbox, right? So you send someone a sponsorship email and you can say, okay, if they don't respond in a week, put that back at the top of my inbox so I can email them again. So what should you watch out for here? 1, not iterating. 2, not practicing. 3, not highlighting. So if you're not constantly improving your sponsorship process, you're probably going to stagnate. If you find out really early on that your tiers are way too expensive for like 90% of the companies you talk to, you should probably lower them and just get more sponsors. If you're not practicing your pitch frequently, it's going to be really awkward, right? The first time you explain your hackathon to people is going to sound way less good than the 10th time you explain it. And not highlighting, right? Make sure you're being concise and highlighting the proper information for each sponsor and really focus on this. And keep notes, right? Because you're going to hear things over and over, and they may not register until you compare all those notes against each other. And ask them what they want, right? Like, this is not a SaaS product where you're just clicking a button and buying something. This is a transaction where you're going to be working together, more like consulting than like software sales. So, some final pro tips. Just like you should over budget, you should also under promise and over deliver, right? Tell sponsors that they're going to get way less than you think they're actually going to get. Because if they're excited about that, they're going to be fucking stoked when you exceed their expectations. Follow up with your sponsors. It's great to go to a hackathon and have a really awesome experience at it. But if you can't go back to your boss and prove to them why that money was well spent, they're not going to want to sponsor again. So you need to send them post-event information. A thank you note means a lot. Photos mean a ton because it's physical evidence that like this happened and you were awesome and everyone loved you and was wearing your t-shirt. Surveys are really good. They're like marketer catnip. If you can get surveys, no matter how fluffy you think that data is, it's insights. Like, they may not use it to change the direction of their company, but it's something that they can look at, right? If you could tell them, okay, we had 10,000 tweets and they were 90% positive about your brand, like, that's cool. They can show that to their boss. If you have a survey that says, before the hackathon, I didn't know who Microsoft was, and now I'm super familiar with them, that's great, okay? I'm way more likely to work at Microsoft now that I went to this hackathon. Ask those kinds of survey questions and give that data to your sponsors because it'll help them prove the value and come back in the future. It also looks really professional. So use right of first refusal to upsell sponsors. So you want to pit your sponsors against each other a little bit. This is a sort of a dangerous move if you don't do it right. But basically, some sponsors will want exclusivity, and you can leverage that against other sponsors in the same category, right? So, just give you an example, like American Airlines and Delta probably won't sponsor the same hackathon together, but one of them is going to pay a premium to be the only one there. And then give them the right of first refusal. If you have a good relationship with a company, give them the opportunity to sponsor before you go to someone else. That's a huge sign of trust. And it's something that they really value because they will have the chance to go to their boss and sell this, right? Because the person you're pitching to is your champion in that company. You don't know who they're reporting to. You don't know who's making the decision, but they're selling this for you internally. And you need to give them the opportunity to do that so that they don't feel like they've been betrayed. Sell your team and expertise, right? Your team is doing this. Why are you awesome? Why are you different from every other hackathon? It helps, to be specific in a certain area, right? Are you the only hackathon in Colorado? Great. You're probably going to have a way easier time getting Colorado companies to sponsor your hackathon than that one in New York. Another thing that some sponsors have started to look for, and I apologize, this is so self-promotional, but it's true, is being an MLH event. Sponsors that go to a lot of hackathons know what our quality bar is for events, and they use that as a criteria for evaluation, because if you pass our quality bar, it means a couple of things. It means you have a venue locked in, right? It means that you have a date, and it means that you're agreeing to certain things like a code of conduct, to make the event free for attendees, to have a certain style of event that's open to college students from around the area. They know what our criteria are, and if you've passed that, it's a good sign for them. It's not going to, be the make or break, but it's definitely a good signal. Be regular and be timely. Oh my God. I can't tell you how many sponsorship deals have been lost because someone didn't check their email for a month and never followed up with that sponsor's question, right? Someone might have emailed you asking what time does your event start? If you never respond, you're not going to look really reliable, and they're not going to want to give you money, okay? This is leading up to the event. It's during the event. It's after the event. Be timely. Be fucking professional. I know that all of your friends use Facebook Messenger to communicate, but Sponsors use email, and you'll get a ton of email, and you have to respond to all of them. I'm sorry. And be willing to negotiate. Sponsors that have done this before know what actual sponsorships are worth, and sponsors that haven't done this before negotiate as a matter of principle, okay? I've gone into meetings where the person lower on the chain has told me like, hey, you need to double your price in this proposal before I show it to my boss because they're gonna cut it in half just on principle, okay? Like, it doesn't actually matter. The number is irrelevant, but they just wanna negotiate to feel like they got a good deal, okay? And be willing to negotiate, but don't be willing to negotiate too much. If someone wants that $50,000 package for $1,000, you know, tell them that they should find a different event. And have a contract. This is something you should talk to a lawyer about. I'm not a lawyer, but having a contract is really important because it defines what a sponsor is getting in writing. It defines when they're required to pay, and it gives them basic legal terms that they can take back to their team. A smaller startup probably won't ask for a contract. Bigger companies often will require it. You should just have one as a matter of principle. It feels more professional. It's a really good way of clarifying everything you've talked about, right? Because you get on the phone and you're like, oh yeah, we could totally give your t-shirts away at like registration. And then they buy a package that's not in. And you need to clarify in writing what they're actually getting so that they understand it. So common pitfalls. The number one pitfall that every salesperson ever has to deal with is a maybe. It's way better to get a no than a maybe, okay? If someone is on the fence, it's a no. Assume that if they haven't said yes, it's no. When someone says, oh yeah, we're thinking about sponsoring this, like, you know, I'll get back to you soon, that's a no, okay? Keep that in mind. There are ways to turn maybes into yeses, or at least turn maybes into decisions. A technique, for example, which I'm totally blanking on the name of, I apologize, but it's a really effective technique to get an answer, and it's something people are really uncomfortable with, is you email someone that you've had conversations with and you say, hey, are you going to buy this package or this package, right? They can't say maybe, they have to say, oh, we're gonna buy this one, or sorry, we're not interested, right? There's a lot of things like that that you could look up, like Google sales techniques, employ them. It's important to force people to make a decision because if they have 1,000 other things on their to-do list, they honestly might be putting this off to the point where they don't have to make a decision and it's a default no. Understand payment cycles. Swift talked about this already. This is so important because someone's going to have to spend the money for the Red Bull at your event or the water at your event or the venue for your event. And if you don't have that cash in the bank, who's laying that out? Now, one nice advantage of working with your school, despite them taking away 10% and generally being a pain in the ass to deal with from an accounting perspective, is that they'll probably front the money for you. So think about that. You do relinquish a lot of control, though. Value what you're selling, right? If you don't believe in the sponsorship opportunity that you're selling, no one else is going to buy it. You need to not only value and understand what you're selling and why it's valuable, you need to actually know why it's valuable to those sponsors, okay? If your sponsorship opportunity seems too cheap, someone may not sponsor it for that reason, right? Like, if you're selling a 1,000-person event for $500, that's really scary, okay? It's like, why does this person not understand what this is worth, okay? So understand the value, understand why it's valuable, and believe it yourself so that you can sell it to other people. Great. We've covered a ton of info. I know that was super dense. A lot of this is also online. I've written blog posts about it. We have some of it in the guide. We have recordings of this talk. And now, ask me anything. Any questions? Yeah. A good CPA for a collegiate hackathon. That really depends. If you're an API company, if you are a company that wants developers simply to build cool stuff with your API or your platform, the CPA is probably less relevant than the quality of the event. I would rather spend more money on an event that was higher quality than get a better bang for my buck, right? So it's that balancing act of value versus cost. Now, things have changed quite a bit. And this is something that'll be interesting, hopefully, from a historical perspective. When I used to organize hackathons and sponsor them 5 or 6 years ago, the maximum sponsorship for Hackathon was around $5,000, right? Now it's around $50,000 to $100,000. There's a huge inflation right now of Hackathon prices. And so what you could get previously for a $500 API sponsorship is now a $3,000 API sponsorship. Dave, I think, knows this firsthand. I'm sure Danielle and Mike have seen this as well. So I don't have a great answer for you because it depends on the event. A premium event like MHacks or PenApps is going to charge you more per person, even though it's a bigger event, than something small and sort of like niche but really high quality like HackRU. Okay, so there are a lot of events out there that are really high quality, have a lot of people, but aren't like interested in branding in the way that will let them charge premium prices. And so you need to find those diamonds in the rough because that's where you really get the most bang for your buck. Yeah, other questions? Yeah. Yeah. For sponsors? Oh. Totally. So the question is, how do you deal with hackathon organizer imposter syndrome, right? Is your hackathon worth sponsoring? That's a tough question. So some of it is solved by getting traction, right? If you have people signing up for your event and you have a venue on the table and you've started contacting food vendors, it feels real, and that's something you can use to sell, right? If you haven't launched a registration page, it's going to be really scary to sell to a sponsor. And the reason for that is because you're not sure the event is going to happen, so why should someone else give you money for that? Okay, so it helps to get traction both for yourself and for the actual sales opportunity, because if you're not confident it's going to happen, it's going to be really hard for someone else to be. I think that like from a psychological sense, sometimes you just have to fake it till you make it. Sponsorships and hackathon sponsorships in particular are really fascinating because people are putting money down for something that a very minimal amount of work has happened on. And oftentimes, they're agreeing to sponsor something that like maybe even won't happen, okay? And so they understand that risk. They probably won't lose the money, right? Like no one's going to be stealing their money here, but they understand that risk, and traction is really the only way to mitigate that risk because it becomes way harder to cancel your event when you already have 1,000 people signed up, okay? So I would just recommend like get traction. You'll feel better as a result, and sponsors will feel better as a result. Even if all it is like an email list that you launch. Yeah. Yeah. So are the significant increases in the frequency and number of hackathons causing a downward trend in hackathon sponsorship prices? Kind of the opposite is happening. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So one is that 5 years ago, the biggest hackathon you would see is probably like in the 150 to 200 person range. Now they're in the 1,000 to 2,000 person range. And so there are more larger events available to sponsor, which justifies a price increase. The next thing is that more non-traditional hackathon companies are getting involved in sponsoring. And not only do they have bigger budgets, but they're trying to emulate the little guys, right? So when you have, whatever, like big bank, like evil conglomerate coming in to sponsor your hackathon, they want to feel cool and innovative and get the best candidates, just like that startup does. But, and this is going to sound a little like weird, like they may not have the same insights that that startup does, and their solution to that is spending more money. Okay, this is like a really frequent thing, is that someone thinks that a solution to their problems is to spend more money on it. You see that all the time at huge companies. Sometimes it is the solutions, it's usually not. And so that's causing prices to inflate, but it doesn't seem to be leveling out yet. It's hard to say. Like, this is an existential question, right? Are hackathons going to continue to be an effective recruitment strategy for the next 10 years? And are they going to be an effective sponsorship opportunity? From a really philosophical level, right, there is a huge deficit in talented programmers. There was one stat I read that said there are 300 to 400,000 new engineering job opportunities every year, and only 40,000 people graduating with CS degrees, right? So if that gap doesn't close, you'll be fine. If for some reason you start to see a lot more qualified engineers, sponsorship is going to tank, right? Because you won't have to spend as much to recruit. Yeah.
So in our experience in planning for Hackcon, a lot of sponsors want to get custom deals.
Yeah.
We argue for like each of the tiers we already stipulated and put in mind.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile fitting custom deals into
Yeah. Yep. So how do you fit custom deals into sponsorship tiers? The way I'd look at it is if you want to get really detailed, determine your inventory. Okay, so there are certain things that actually have limited capacity, right? Time on stage, you should budget a fixed amount of time that you're selling to sponsors and don't go over that. How much space do you have at your event for sponsors? How many parking spots do you have? Like, who knows? But you need a limit so that when that sponsor comes in and they say, oh, I don't care about the logo on the t-shirt, but I really wanted that time on stage, you know how much you can actually sell. Right? And you budget for that when you're estimating how many people will buy each tier. That's how I would solve that problem, right? Because ultimately, like, it doesn't matter what they're removing from the package, right? It only matters what they're adding. And if you know what each of those things is worth, then it'll help you determine how to customize that proposal, okay? So if your limiting factor is space, that should be at a premium. If your limiting factor is time, that should be at a premium. And that's how you should determine it. Any other questions? Cool. I mean, I'll be around all weekend. You can email me anytime, tweet at me, John Marco. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to refer you to sponsors sometimes. We actually have a mailing list where we send out sponsorship opportunities to different companies. So if you have like a prospectus or something you want us to blast out, let us know. And yeah, cool. Thanks for listening and hope you enjoy lunch.